So, hi, I'm Mark Waugh. I'm Artistic Director of the Art360 Foundation and the Chair of the International Curators Forum. But apart from that, I suppose I had myriad different hats on. Particularly most recently, I was the Head of Development at DAX, which is Design and Artist Copyright Society. And since, I guess, around 2015, 2016, I've been increasingly interested in the impact of blockchain on the arts ecology. I've had various roles in places like the Arts Council, so I have quite a deep insight into the way in which technology impacts on the whole ecology. And I'm interested here to discuss some of the ways in particular I think the visual arts economy is going to take some really interesting leaps forward with the technology. Yeah, so blockchain is an interesting. I mean, what is it? Obviously, it's a technology. It's a technological infrastructure quite similar to HTML insofar as, it's a protocol on which things are built. It's evolved quite rapidly from, I suppose, the early incarnations around Bitcoin, where there's very much just something about financial transactions, to the evolution through Ethereum, which is a blockchain system which allowed contracts to be written into the code, which defined the types of transaction. And at that point, I think it became really interesting to the arts world. And it's around that development of the smart contracts, which the NFT market has also grown. But fundamentally, it's probably confusing to focus on the technology side of blockchain, because what blockchain actually is, it's a discourse around the decentralization of power and data. And that's what's really fundamental. So when we talk about the decentralization of power and data, we are saying that there are protocols which everybody has to adhere to, and those have to be adhered to in a transparent system in order for them to be recorded on a blockchain. And those protocols of agreement can be written by diverse parties who don't necessarily need to meet each other, but they have to agree to the standards. And that's a big revolution in terms of data. And to zoom back another step, why are we interested in these kind of transparent data systems? Because quite chaotically and haphazardly, business infrastructures have been built on a multiplicity of different platforms which don't integrate with each other. And although many people would say that's fine, competing infrastructure databases are not a problem, you can also say in the long duration, that just caused too much confusion and incapacity of the business to develop at scale. And we were really interested at DAX in looking into what the operational opportunity for artists might be if blockchain became a dominant infrastructure across the ecology. Yeah, I recommend anyone have a look at the report we published in 2018, the Art Market 2.0. You can search that online, and you'll see there a series of conclusions looking from someone who was based in the kind of financial industry. So they understood how the futures market worked in the financial industry. And they took all of that knowledge with people from the Alan Turing Institute and the Oxford Internet Institute and said, what is blockchain likely to do for the arts ecology? And their conclusions were quite prophetic. They thought it offered a very serious opportunity to scale the ways in which artists could financialize their artworks, because you could create a transparent infrastructure on which business can be developed. And they looked at fractionalization, where more than one person has an investment opportunity in an artwork. But they also looked at kind of provenance and the importance of provenance within that, most particularly thinking about the ways in which, in industries such as oil, food consumption, blockchain had been prototyped and experimented with as a way of ensuring that goods that arrived at market were as described. And obviously for the art world, that's a fundamental challenge. Is the work you're buying legitimate? Is it a fake? Is it authentic? Is it of the value that it pertains to be? And so that's, from my point of view, that's the long history of blockchain in terms of rights management that I've been interested in. But it's probably useful to jump forward and say a little bit about how I kind of implemented that within the industry. So at DAX, I was leading, I suppose, the infrastructure and development of new technological opportunities for artists to improve the ways in which they work. And we like to be kind of responsive to what artists need rather than just imagining those needs for them. And we were approached by a sculptor called Maurice Blick, who had a concern that he felt that in the era of 3D printing and basically the resin coated bronzes, there was a real problem that the market didn't understand what an authentic bronze work is, one that's cast in a foundry, and that there needed to be some kind of hallmark for bronze. So we had a few conversations with Morris, and it was evident that this is a really interesting idea, insofar as bronze is not necessarily the most valuable metal. It's not like silver or gold, where it's likely to be melted down per se, as a commodity in itself. But it's definitely the material of choice for artists working sculpturally. And so this question of a hallmark for it seemed to make sense. But that's a very analog technology. And so what I did was think about that in relationship to blockchain technology, and came up with a solution where we would actually work with a partner called Verisart to create a system of certification for the bronzes, which would be in partnership with foundries. So essentially, at the point at which the artist and the foundry collaborate to create a cast, that would be documented. And part of the documentation would include this new hallmark, which would be printed into the wax. And that would then be visible in the artwork. And the digital certificate is a recording of the dimensions and other details that you have of the work. And also any other kind of, I guess, hidden details that you might want of the work. And that detail is then synthesized into a certificate, which is recorded on the blockchain. So what we were doing, we were updating the technology of the hallmark. People have rings on their fingers, etc. These all have a hallmark on it. Essentially, the hallmark is a kind of analog blockchain. It's a distributed set of data that travels globally and through time to tell you who made what and when. And so that is what we were doing. We're creating a different narrative around what a hallmark might be in the digital era. So it was a really interesting kind of prototype. Particularly, I guess for me, it was interesting because I was very hands-on in working with the foundry to create the certificates. So the foundries would do the documentation of the certificates with the artist. They would send me that data, and then I would create the certificate and essentially authenticate that certificate, and then share the certificate and the link so that they could then transfer it at point of sale. So it was a process where I was very, very close to. And I guess for Dax, what was interesting about Bronzechain is it allowed us to understand the types of challenges that you might have working with blockchain and the artist community. Which are, let's be honest about that, they're quite myriad insofar as when you talk to people and you say, what digital tools do you use? Some will say, blah, blah, blah. They have a whole list of them. Others will say, I have a mobile phone, but I'm not very comfortable with the apps on it. It depends, to what degree an artist is analog or digital. Most are working on some kind of liminal space in between, developing these digital skills. But still, to many of them, the idea of this digital certificate and its relationship to a physical work was still quite complicated to communicate. And I guess that one of the fundamental obstacles will remain, what the relationship is between the digital certificate of something and the physical. So there are all sorts of, solutions that are emerging, which I don't need to go into, such as, virtual DNA, etc. But fundamentally, that is a complexity. Yeah, I think that the question of validating and checking the authenticity of authors is fundamental to blockchain. I think in the whole media kind of feeding frenzy around NFTs, part of that is fueled by the fact of bad agents, or if you like, I suppose, agents wanting to play the system and enjoying that. So the question of being able to appropriate other artists' work who might be asleep to the digital realm and make money out of it. To some people, that's a laugh. To others, that's really ethically not, what the future should look like. So there's a real question around, who are the authors of the work? And it's really important to understand that different platforms have different approaches to that. Some are more laissez-faire than others. I think if I was an artist, I would be looking to platforms which are really serious about the authentication of the players. And I think that's what's really interesting about the Imprimo platform. So the Imprimo platform was developed as an infrastructure for artists. it came out of a context which is slightly different to the UK, Canada, and that what's interesting about that in Canada, like the States, you have to, I suppose, you have to prove the authorship of each work that you want copyrighted. And so that's a system which comes from that mindset. I'm going to prove that I made this work. And in order to do that, you have to authenticate yourself with the platform and prove that you are that rights owner. So there are a whole series of protocols that you can go through there, which is similar to a bank. It's your passport details, email addresses, etc. And those give you, I guess, that financial layer of security around, okay, I am the author of these works. And that's the fundamental of blockchain. It puts you into an ecology where you claim rights and ownership over assets. And in claiming that series of rights, you put yourself in a position of power and control in negotiation with others. So what's interesting about Imprimo is it doesn't just allow you to do that, but it then allows you to build additional provenance around the work. So when I described with Bronzechain this whole process of moving parts with the kind of documentation of artworks, creation of certificates, etc., that could be perceived as, oh, that's a lot of work. But actually, the proving the additional detail around a work is really critical. And within Imprimo, there's the possibility to create the timeline of an artwork and to define an artwork, not just by what it looks like in its dimensions, but where it's been exhibited, if it's been sold, more information about the process of the making of that artwork. And that level of, I guess, infinite detail is really critical, because in the catalog raisonné of the future, that's the information you're going to need. It's the full history of a work and how it exists in the world. And I think that often is perceived as kind of the bureaucracy of art. But I think that you're not going to be a very successful artist in the future unless you have some tools which make that bureaucracy meaningful and useful to you. And I think that's really fascinating about platforms like Imprimo, which are thinking first about the artists and their capacity to manage their rights in the digital realm. Yeah, I think that's really that for me, the story of an artwork is really critical here, and imagining how that story will be told in the future. So when people look at the informal market, as it's described, and let's be clear here, the NFTs and some fake NFTs or artists who aren't the authors of it selling it is small fry in relationship to what we would really describe as a secondary market on the global scale, where major artists' works go into collections with very unclear provenance. And recent reports in sort of 2019, 2020 were estimating that something like 50% of the secondary market might be suspect. So everybody is seeing fake fortune, and you see how easy it is for the provenance of a work to become very slippery. Not that difficult to create the illusion of authenticity without it being a fact. Where blockchain comes in, it says, okay, look, these are all the fissures and cracks within the system which are very vulnerable, and here's where we're going to find solutions which are robust. And that's really going to be critical to the future. It's the finite detail. As I said, you can, with the blockchain, there's a capacity to make certain things very visible and public, but there's also the capacity to store more sort of, I guess, kind of, encrypted and secret data around works. And that is the future. It's you being able to prove in some depth what your relationship to the construction of this work is and why it might look potentially like somebody else's. But if you then look into the archaeology of the work, no, this is a different thing entirely. So I think that's really important. The future of the work and its story is what Imprimo is really designed to facilitate.
Yeah. So this festival that you're very kindly contributing to, the NTU Web3 Festival, is about all aspects of Web3, and we view that as being the intersection of artificial intelligence, AR, XR, and blockchain. And you've been, I think, I can say this, something of a visionary in terms of seeing the early applications of blockchain in your work when you were at DAX, and now your involvement with Imprimo. But as we're wrapping up this interview, I want to prompt you to comment on what your views are about Web3 as a whole and what the future might hold.
Yeah, so I think the interesting thing about Web3, which probably people are going to be cautious about calling the metaverse just because of the kind of the noise around what's happening with Facebook, but I think the metaverse is not a bad metaphor for it. It's about, I guess, the evolution of the web as a general platform. What we came to a situation with, Web 2.0 is quite a capacity to share social assets, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, but a weak infrastructure. Web 3.0 is about capacity to have a much more resilient infrastructure using systems like blockchain to as we said, to financialize content at scale and with certainty of authorship. But it's also the capacity to build on that infrastructure all types of different kind of immersive experiences. So, VR, for example, is something that has been tested in kind of cinemas, etc., quite extensively. It's not a new technology, but it's a technology that's been waiting for the technical infrastructure on which it can really thrive and become kind of second nature. And that is something which we're moving towards. It's the capacity to have high quality visual experiences in an immersive context, and that's something that artists really love. Augmented reality is something again which has been tested in various kind of degrees of resolution for some time, but it's a fantastic tool for kind of delivering data and different visual experiences which merge the real world and the virtual world. And that merging is fantastic in terms of accessibility. Not everybody is mobile and able to be at different places in the world. And in terms of thinking about the positive aspects of COVID, we've realized that actually content and contact can be facilitated in really dynamic ways, in a virtual environment. And augmented reality and VR combine to facilitate both of those things in ways which are going to be really important. So in the museum of the future, you'll always think about the locality and the physical experiences of your users, but you'll now always be thinking about virtual audiences. And you'll want your artists to be thinking about that and supporting that access for you to develop international markets and international audiences for commercial and public galleries. So during COVID, we saw quite an acceleration amongst the commercial gallery segment because they couldn't do art fairs, etc. So they began to invest in those tools. But also that is something that the public galleries, like national galleries, have done really deep dives into those experiences to facilitate a different audience engagement with their works. So Web 3.0, I suppose it's the materialization of the vision of what the future looks like. And there'll be a few bumps in the road, and there's a lot of spend that might, not necessarily deliver for everyone's in the ways that they imagined, but it's certainly the direction of travel. And digital licensing, digital rights management are all going to be invested in those spaces. And for artists, they will want to be thinking about a larger reach for their work and the capacity to reach across virtual and real environments.
Mark, thank you so much for your time today. It's been great hearing your thoughts.
Brilliant. Thank you. Are we good?
Yeah, we're good. That was great. Thank you very much.